Well, I'm going to start exactly at noon so that if people have questions, there's time to ask.
Sure.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I think people are going to start slowly coming in to the meeting, but I'm going to start on time because I want to make sure there's plenty of time to ask questions at the end. So you are at the ASLA Southern California Climate Action Committee's first webinar. I want to thank the sponsors and all our members, and especially Dr. Steve Winager, who is Executive Director of the beloved Santa Barbara Botanic Gardens. He's going to be talking about why the 30% threshold of planting native plants in every landscape is an important one. So I'm going to pass it on to Steve. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for letting me talk to everybody today. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you'll be able to see the screen and not my notes. All right. So first off, again, thank you. Hi, I'm Steve Winager. I am the Executive Director here at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. If you haven't come up to Santa Barbara to visit us for a while, I encourage you to make the drive from LA or anywhere else in Southern California to come on up. We've had some rain now, and the garden is looking really beautiful. So we'd love to share it with you if you have a chance for a visit. But let's get right into it. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, we are the nation's first botanic garden, or the oldest botanic garden dedicated exclusively to native plants. We were founded in 1926 and really focused from the very beginning on the values that native plants can provide to the natural world. What's really interesting is that this is, sorry, let me minimize that. What's really interesting is that even from the very earliest days, we knew that native plants were more than just unique and different here in California. They helped us understand build gardens that could conserve water as well as other resources. And this is back in 1930 when this was still pretty ahead of the time. And those early founders really set up the vision for the garden. It was filled with folks like Lockwood DeForest, Beatrix Ferrand, other incredible designers that helped really set a new standard for what the public gardens here in California and around the world needed to look like. And again, we were the first one dedicated exclusively to native plants. And so we've now had 100 years of sort of working through that. We've really become to understand just how critical that is. We're still very much a beautiful destination, again, welcoming guests from around the world. But we've also really started to look at how do we use native plants as more than decoration, as a key to conserving biodiversity and addressing climate change. That we feel that native plants have a power to improve our lives in so many different ways. And we'll talk about that today. So for starters, our culture, at least here in California, I think has finally come to grips with the fact that we are in a changing climate, and that climate change is an important issue we have to deal with, as evidenced by the fact that this chapter or this committee is the Climate Change Committee. But the truth is, we face two crises right now for our world. It's not just climate change, but it's also biodiversity. And there was a report that was done, a joint report that was done by both the IPCC as well as the UN's Biodiversity Conference to say that we are in this joint crisis of both biodiversity and climate change. And we need to address them both together, which makes them both more difficult to address in some ways. Here in California, so we have about a third of the species on the planet, plant species on the planet, are at risk of extinction. And that's also true here in California, where we're a biodiversity hotspot. And that hotspot really does show that we have more diversity in California than any other state in the continental US. And that includes endemic species that only occur here in California and occur nowhere else. There are over 2,000 plant species at risk here in California. And of course, the drivers of that are the things we all know about: habitat loss, invasive species, overexploitation in some cases, so overharvesting, pollution generally. We've seen that in a lot of the desert areas that air pollution has resulted in nitrogen deposition into our deserts, which is actually causing more invasive species issues. And of course, climate change has been a major driver as well. And all those things are impacting biodiversity. But the crazy thing about this is that while all these are adversely affecting biodiversity in plants, plants can also be a key to reversing a lot of these drivers if we use them properly. So we like to think the garden remains very hopeful and optimistic about this because we have a long relationship between humans and plants. And we know that we can work with plants to solve a lot of problems, whether that be to produce food, fiber, and other resources, but also to nurture our own selves and our livelihoods. And so again, we always say that native plants are the foundation of all life on the planet. And I don't have to really talk to a group of landscape architects to talk about how essential is the relationship between people and plants, and how much of the success of our species is because we learned early on how to harvest the power of native plants. Where we now are is we really try to emphasize that native plants are more than just decoration. Plants oftentimes, to the person that's just trying to put something in their front yard or backyard, it's almost like picking a paint color on their walls or something else. But the truth is, native plants provide a whole host of ecosystem services, and that when we harness their power, we can actually make our landscapes be not only beautiful, but also provide a lot of value for improved air quality, include water quality. And what we're increasingly finding out is that our backyards and front yards can be an important part of biodiversity preservation. So again, I already mentioned that a lot of those benefits or ecosystem services are really valuable. One study back in 1999 that was done identified that there were more than, if you combined all the world's global domestic products, all the GDP of all of the nations on the planet, it would only provide the same value that nature provides to us for free. So we can't actually pay this back if we wanted to. And so we needed to really be thoughtful as how we design these landscapes to do more than just be attractive. So one of the challenges is if we think about climate change in isolation from biodiversity, there have been a lot of projects around the world that have focused on planting more trees in order to sequester carbon. The problem with that is oftentimes they're planting fast-growing non-native trees in monocultures, and that actually can contribute more to biodiversity loss. While it can sequester a lot of carbon, it actually solves one problem by making another problem worse. And so we want to make sure that as we think about how we approach climate change, we're making sure to both provide for biodiversity and the conservation of species along with sequestering carbon. And that's where we talk about this as planting with purpose. We all want to make choices about our landscapes to ensure that they're not only beautiful, but they're also beneficial. When we plant with purpose, our efforts can deliver all the beneficial outcomes we talked about earlier, such as mitigating the impacts of climate change, sequestering carbon, reducing erosion, conserving water, providing food, for improving air and water quality, and mitigating even noise pollution. But they can't do it with, and they can do it while also supporting all the life on the planet. But not all plants are equally as good at protecting biodiversity. Native plants have been shown to have a better connection to the species in their area to provide them with food and sustenance. And that's sort of obvious because the native plants in the place have evolved with the insects in that place over millions of years. And those evolutionary relationships are what make the native plants at any given place more successful than plants from somewhere else. And that goes right on up the food chain. So as we've been researching this, we've got a couple of projects here in Santa Barbara that we're actually gathering data between native and non-native landscapes to compare the use of insects. And this is patterned after a project that was done in the mid-Atlantic over on the other side of the US by Doug Tallamy. If you're not familiar with this book, I highly encourage you to get it. A lot of the facts and figures I'm going to present here in the next few minutes are derived from this book. Anyway, he said that he was looking at Lepidoptera, or butterflies and moths in particular, and he compared the value of native to introduced plants in terms of the ability to serve as host plants for those butterflies and moths. He did an exhaustive search of records in the literature that looked at over almost 1,400 plant genera, so genuses of plants occurring in the mid-Atlantic, and their ability to support insects, in particular Lepidoptera. Basically, overall insect diversity and abundance increases with native plants, and it results in more bird food for the birds, so they also have higher populations. So, but not all native plants are created the same. What he found is that here's a list of some species. We see oak species, which are a very old genus that evolved a long time ago in evolutionary standards, have a much higher number of Lepidoptera species that take advantage of them versus other native species in the mid-Atlantic that have very few. So what he did find is that woody plants in general are better than herbaceous plants for butterflies, particularly during the caterpillar stage, than are other species. And he also found that woody ornamentals, native woody ornamentals, are up to 14 times more effective for Lepidoptera species than non-native species. And that's true. That's still, all native plants are better than introduced species, but they're only 3 times better. But woody ornamentals are 14 times more impactful than non-native plants. One example, though, is of a non-native that's here in California is Eucalyptus stellulata, which I believe is blackjack eucalyptus. And it hosts about 48 insect species in Australia, but here in California, it only serves 1. And that's because, again, the insects aren't brought over with it, and we certainly don't have any koala bears out here. And so really, that plant could be a beautiful plant, but it doesn't provide the value to our communities that native species would be able to provide otherwise. Another example is, looks like somebody needs to mute themselves. But another example is, of course, monarch butterfly and the milkweed. Non-native tropical milkweed has become a problem. It's being planted all over the place. It is a beautiful plant. There's no question about it. And because it's evergreen, it really is a better garden plant species in some ways. But unlike our native milkweeds, it doesn't die back in the winter. And what's happened is that there's a protozoan parasite called OE that grows on milkweed that actually will parasitize and actually causes some really deformities in monarch butterflies that eat this OE as a caterpillar. The best way to keep that material from building up is for the plant to either die back in the winter so that all of its above ground material dies back to the ground, or if you're going to use non-native tropical milkweed, to go ahead and cut it back once a year so that it actually regrows and doesn't have that OE parasite on the outside of the plant. But again, we think that the easiest way to deal with this is just to go ahead and make sure that you're using native milkweeds instead. Bees are in a similar way to have a similar story to tell over Lepidoptera. Native bees are up to 4 times more likely than native plants are 4 times more likely to attract native bees than non-native plants. And for many of us, we're very familiar with honeybees, but of course, honeybees are non-native animals. They were brought over from Europe and Eurasia, and they are foreign here. They are generalists, so they tend to pollinate almost everything, but like many generalists, they don't pollinate anything terribly well. We have 1,600 different species of bees here in California that are oftentimes very closely related to a single or few species of plants. And that's really critical because they are much better pollinators of those species that they work with on a regular basis than honeybees might be. Good example of this is that native orchard bees can be up to 120 times more efficient at pollination services for apples than honeybees. And that's just because of the way they're structured and the way that they've evolved with the type of flower that the apples have. But of course, it extends beyond just bees and lepidopteras. Many of us are familiar with the galls that will often form on oak trees. These oak galls are formed because a wasp will lay its eggs inside in the outer cambium layer of the oak tree, and the oak tree responds by building this sort of encapsulating that what it considers an infection with a woody growth around it. It doesn't cost the tree very much, but it ends up being a really wonderful home for that wasp baby to sort of grow and develop and then eventually eat its way out and then go on to lay its own eggs. These galls are also really sought after by spiders, mites, other insects that after their original occupant evacuates, they oftentimes get recolonized by other insects, forming an entire ecosystem all in of themselves. In most cases, the oak galls, though, are specific to one species of oak at a time. And so, again, if you lose the oak tree, you're going to lose those oak galls. And a really interesting thing is that there's actually a parasite that parasitizes the oak gall wasp, and it will come and it will lay its eggs into the larva that's pupating within that oak gall. So again, if you lose the oak trees, you're going to lose 2 different species of these wasps. And again, it's a part of the chain that they can't use just any species. They have to use the oaks that they're most used to. Another example is manzanitas. There is a gall-forming aphid that will lay its eggs in the manzanita on manzanita leaves, and it causes the leaf to sort of bend over and turn this bright red color, but it creates a little shell that it can lay its broods in. And that's great. And again, not only is the aphid using those shells to lay its eggs, but after they're abandoned, they're oftentimes used by a number of other insects for homes and habitat. So we're actually, we recognize that while I'd like to have every landscape be 100% native, that's probably an unreasonable thing to do right now. But so we've sort of put on our thinking cap, and our recommendation is to try to make sure that that in the areas we live, work, and play, we have 30% coverage of native plants. And I'm happy to answer questions about what we mean by plant coverage. And in most cases, we're looking at percent cover when you're looking at it from above to below. So one plant could cover a lot of ground, and you could take a bunch of plants to cover the same amount of space. So it's really just percent cover by native species. So let's look at why we settled on that 30% number. We did a meta-analysis of over 54 studies of invasive plants and their impact on invertebrates. And we found that when invasive species get above 70% dominance, that biodiversity begins to plummet, particularly the insect biodiversity, but insect and birds most obviously. And so that 30% lower in terms of overall richness, and the species that were in those invasive areas were very different, and oftentimes non-native insects were colonizing these non-native dominated plots. But then if you rip out those non-native plants and you bring back some more native species, once you get below a 70% dominance of non-native species, you actually start to see a rebound of native insects. Butterflies have been pretty heavily studied, and it's most of what this stuff is for, because we found that the Lepidoptera, or the caterpillar phase of butterflies, often has a very tight relationship to one or just two or three other plant species, and that makes them good indicators for how valuable native plants are. So again, looking at a study of over 78 species, they found that for most butterflies, they require at least 15% high quality habitat in order not just to be able to lay eggs and rear young, but even just to be able to effectively move through a habitat so that they can migrate through while still having nectar resources. Unfortunately, most cities only have 19 to 69% green space. And so if you want to have a total of 15% high quality habitat, you need to really probably be expecting to double that. So again, we're looking at a sort of doing the math. If we only have 50% green space, we have to make sure that 30% of that 50% green space has at least 30% native plants. Birds are also a critical user of native plant habitat, mainly because 90% of birds feed insects to their young. They don't oftentimes as birds mature, they become seed eaters, they'll eat other things, but almost all birds eat insects when they are in their formative stages and they're really just developing. Non-native landscapes produce fewer bugs, and so it produces fewer birds. Lower insect availability will lead to lower young and reduced reproductive success. And again, particularly when native plant biomass falls below about 70%. So we sort of looked at all the data. We said, there's 70%, if you have more than 70% non-native plants or invasive plants, biodiversity plummets. We need at least 15% high quality habitat for butterflies. We have below 70% native plant biomass. Many native bird species populations are reduced. So we settled on the sort of 30% as the average across the board, but we look at that as a floor. Hopefully, many of our landscapes might have 50 or even 75 or hopefully 100% native plant landscapes, but all those will feed together. And as long as we keep that above that floor, we feel like we can do our front yards or backyards, our landscapes can do a much better job of preserving biodiversity. So again, we feel like native plants are definitely part of the solution. They are sustaining all life on the planet. If you lose so native plants and insects together form about 75 to 80% of the entire biomass on the planet. So if we lose native plants and if we lose the insects that depend on native plants, it ripples all the way up the rest of the food chain. And so we feel like the critical thing is to get more native plants out there. The wonderful thing is that these insects that oftentimes are so critical to the rest of biodiversity don't need a lot of space. So your backyard can be a source of wildlife habitat without having to say that it's going to be protecting black bears and mountain lions. Native insects can go a long ways to preserving the rest of the life on the planet. So hopefully I've convinced you that 30% is the goal that would be reasonable and we can all shoot for. So how are we going to get there? Well, first off, I should mention that I used to work at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, and I got a chance to, I got to know Mrs. Johnson, and I got to work with her for a number of years. She always said that the garden is where we all meet. And why the garden? It's that zone where people, plants, and other animals all have a role in success that can transcend politics. It transcends all sorts of things. It's that partnership where we work with plants and we work with the animals and the pollinators that they need to make a habitat that's good for us all. And certainly that's what landscape architects do. But this is a place where nature can really open up around us and really reground us. So I think it's really important that the garden can be that spot where we start to reverse the trend of decline in biodiversity right in our own backyards. So our strategy here at the garden is threefold. So we want to grow the native plant movement, and we'll talk a little bit how we're trying to do that. We want to make sure that we can regenerate ecosystem health, and of course, native plants are a core part of that. And then build lasting change so that we have a sustainable approach to the survival of species long term. We're taking a three-part approach to growing the native plant movement. If we're working with Theodore Payne Foundation of the California Native Plant Society, we've started offering a program for professional horticulturists and landscapers to be able to get a certification on how to manage native plants. If you're familiar with native plants already, you know that they oftentimes require a different maintenance strategy than some of your non-native plants. It's not enough to just water them and leave them alone. In fact, sometimes watering them in certain seasons of the year can actually do damage to those plants. So understanding how best to manage them is a really important skill set that many of our landscapers don't have. So we have a certification program that we're offering now that's been very popular. In fact, each one of our classes, and we've done 6 now, have sold out with the 30 participants that we allow in each class. We're also working on increasing the demand of native plants by encouraging folks, like in this talk, to use more native plants. And finally, we're working with growers to try to figure out how do we better increase the supply of native plants in a way that is sustainable for them as part of their business, as well as to make sure they're available to the native plant enthusiasts that want to get those plants. We also want to work on regenerating ecosystem health. For those of you who don't know, we have a large team of scientists here at the garden. We have over 28 conservation scientists here that are working across California to better help mostly the federal and state lands be better managed in the wild. But a lot of the resources that we're learning from that work also applies to our front yards, backyards, and other areas. We also have a research project, a couple of research projects here in Santa Barbara, where we're actually studying, going into areas that are non-native dominated populated areas and planting native plants and seeing how it changes insect and plant diversity while comparing it to the other non-changed, non-native landscapes. And the results have already been staggering. We're quickly seeing the total number of insects increase, the total number of species increase, and also increases in bird diversity, all of which you'd expect, but we're actually having the numbers to really back that up. We're also working on inspiring the next generation of leaders who are going to figure out how to continue the progress that we've already made on native plants. The garden itself also serves as a model, demonstrating what we can do to promote native plants, how you can both have the resources for people as well as the resources for other species. And then we just added a new impact and advocacy director position here at the garden, where we're going to be working to remove barriers to using native plants and to find ways to encourage and hopefully subsidize native plant use in most landscapes. So we're really getting more active and developing policies that will help sustain this effort long term. So I don't have to say what can you do. Of course, if you want to, we'd love it if you're a member at the Botanic Garden, or just send us large checks of money. It's fine too. But also, really, as landscape architects, I hope you're leading the challenge in helping to explain to your clients why some native plants in their landscape are an important part of being able to add value to them. if they want to see this beautiful diversity of insects, if they want to have native, bird life and other things in their backyard, native plants are an important component of that. Yes, they can still have their rose bushes or their favorite plants, but we encourage you to use more and more native plants in your landscape because at the end of the day, you're helping not only your clients, but you're helping the entire world to survive. With that, I'm happy to sort of stop here for a minute or stop and take any questions that you have. But before I do, I will say I get this question all the time. What are some of the top plants for butterflies in the sort of the South Coast region? And most of these are appropriate all the way down into LA. And so I recommend these are the top 6 species that are really effective for promoting butterflies in landscapes around here. So with that, I will stop the share and happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
If you could raise your hand, that might maybe be a little more organized, or just speak out. Maybe just speak out because I can't see everybody.
Hi, I have a question. So I rent my property, so I don't really want to like design the yard. I don't own it. Are there ways to do like raised garden beds or people that are in apartments? Like, how can I also
Yeah, great
do
question.
that?
So many of us can't afford to own our own homes, so we're in the same boat. So obviously, some woody plants are not going to be available to you, so it's hard to grow an oak tree for very long in a container. But there are actually a number of oak trees that work very well a number of trees and woody shrubs that can work very well in containers. Manzanitas are great. I've had a Catalina cherry, which is one of the really high producers, in a large container for 5 years now. Eventually, I'm going to give it away to someone that I can put it in the ground, but you can get a lot of resources out of that. If you have an area where you can have pots, whether it's on your front stoop or in a backyard area, container grown plants can offer a lot for a lot of these species. And again, think about monarch butterflies need that milkweed. Milkweed is a great potted plant. In fact, particularly if you're using the ones that die back to the ground, you can put that pot out of the way when it's not looking its best, and then just bring it back out when they start to grow again. So there are enough, and then also by knowing what's in that pot, you don't accidentally dig up and plant something else on top of that milkweed because you forgot it was there. So there's a lot of container plants that can do a really good job for all this.
And I saw Nikki's hand.
Yeah, it wasn't a question, it was a follow-up for that, Nicole. There is some resources with the Theodore Payne Foundation has a list of container plants that they've done, and also the CNPS, I think Santa Monica chapter has a video. There's a woman who has been very successful, very, very successful in doing patio gardening with native plants, and there are a lot, and the lists are not full, like there's a lot of trial and error, like some things work in some places and not others. I would like to recommend Monardella species are one of my favorite container plant, and they feed a lot of native insects. I've not seen the invasive livestock bees on mine, but I'm always seeing different native bees. Hummingbirds love them, and they make really, really good tea as well. And you can plant them in a larger pot. You can plant them around other species too.
Thank you, Nikki.
Steve?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Stephanie.
Hi, Stephanie.
Hi. We're landscape architects, as many of us are. What is your recommendation for watering natives? We hear mixed views on how to irrigate them, drip line versus overspray. So if you have any feedback for us, we greatly appreciate it.
So for one, it's probably best to not say all native plants need the same thing. They are somewhat unique, it varies by species. So I would say that here at the garden, we have a mixture of both drip irrigation and overhead spray. I haven't noticed that one is particularly better or worse than the other. Obviously, if you have an area where you want ground cover to spread, overhead spray seems to work a little better than drip. But the key that I've found that is more important is really watching seasonality. And so while if you again, the best example is coast live oaks. If you go into an area with mature coast live oaks that have never been irrigated and you start giving them summertime water, they have a high chance of getting a fungal infection that will kill the tree. If, on the other hand, you have coast live oaks that have been planted and have grown up in an irrigated landscape, they can actually handle summer water because they've evolved with it as they got larger. The problem is if you change that irrigation cycle, it could really damage a really beautiful mature tree. And so in those kind of situations, we'd recommend planting things underneath it that can go summer dry. So good examples are coffeeberry as a shrub, or hummingbird sage underneath there, or some of the other ground covers that can just be allowed to go summer dormant, summer dry. And then you can just keep the irrigation away from that plant during the summertime. But again, it does vary. So again, people that have had oaks grow up in an irrigated lawn say, well, my oak tree has no problem with that. Well, it's because from a very small acorn, it's grown up in that same way. And so sometimes it is a little bit trial and error. It's not across the board. It's not always the same. But we do have, as part of our course, training for landscapers, not landscape architects, landscapers, on how to sort of gauge the amount of water that their native plants need, so they can see the early warning signs of too much or too little. Got a couple other questions. Stephanie, I think you were next.
Hi, Steve. Thank you so much, and Elisa, for leading this very great webinar. Yeah, I'm super stoked on the 30% because we deal with a lot of commercial, large scale, I guess, projects. And our biggest issue, well, aside maintenance and, having no one understand how to maintain native, we'll work on that. But we have a huge issue with supply. So when we want to, spec out large sums of these plant material, it's just, we always get the contractors coming back, oh, this is not available. This isn't, and so we're always subbing out plant material where, we would love to use the bush poppies or, things that are more, intuitive to the native landscape. So it sounds like you might be getting some partnerships with growing.
We are working on partnerships. The other thing we're finding out is that the key to this is if it's at all possible, contract grow your plants. Oftentimes, I did this when I was collaborating in Texas with some landscape architects, and a year out, once we designed the plant list, we would, while we're still in the construction phase, we would actually contract out the most critical plants on there. And you'd find a grower that you commit to buying plants from, and they will grow those plants for you oftentimes. And it is the most effective way to make sure you get the plant list that you want. It takes about 9 months lead time. But it is the best way that we've seen to ensure that you get the plants that you want. The nice thing about it is that you're oftentimes getting these plants at below wholesale cost. So while you're investing a little bit more money, you can probably get them at 85% of wholesale because you're committing to buy them in advance and they're getting a guaranteed sale. So there are many wholesalers that will be happy to take a contract grow. And so you just need to reach out to someone, a nursery that you might already know that you do a lot of business with, and do that contract growing. And that's probably the best way to guarantee you're going to have the right plants when you need them.
Awesome,
I
thank
can't
you.
remember who was next. I'm seeing a lot of
It's
hands
Melanie.
up.
I think it was Melanie.
Okay.
Hi, Steve. Another landscape architect here. And as so many of us, we're at the intersection of a lot of different issues, including biodiversity. We're also dealing with the housing crisis. So a lot of the projects that we deal with are these multi-family, multi-story on-structure projects with very low light and very little space for native plants. So designing for it becomes a lot trickier. And I was wondering if there are plants that do better in urban settings, maybe, concrete bottom planters and what the drainage and
Street trees and more urban environments. But it's some of the ones you'd be most common with. Up here, you'd see the coast live oak down in California. Sorry, down in LA area. Oh gosh, there's another live oak species that does better down there. I'm just drawing a blank. But I wouldn't say they go well. They do well in surrounded by when they're planted small. They develop well in areas that can be surrounded by concrete. They don't do well in concrete bottom planters. They need to have good drainage, but they can deal with lower oxygen levels that happen in the street tree setting. I can't give you just an easy list for urban environments, but I will say in some of these design areas, it's still important to have some shared open space. And many of the sages, salvia, the salvias in general, a lot of the soldagos, other species that are perennial but ephemeral, do really well in that small open spaces that be around the complexes that are shared open spaces, around the edges of a lawn or other things. But even in smaller beds can do pretty well. We can get you, we have a publication on our website, which is called Water-Wise Plants for Santa Barbara County. And in that, we also identify which plants are really good in containers, as well as which ones are better in less wild landscape areas. So it's got over 120 native plant species we recommend, all of which are drought tolerant, and we talk about which ones are better for those kind of environments.
It was either Nikki or Stephanie that was next.
Stephanie, you can go ahead if you want.
Thank you, Nikki. Hi, Steve. How are you?
My pleasure. I'm doing great. How are you guys?
Good, good. Thank you. So I wanted to share my experience with contract growing because when I was with the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy as their chief landscape architect, we did some very large projects. And what you have to realize is even though it's sometimes 80% cheaper than buying per plant, you do have a percent failure when you do contract growing, and you have to account for that. That's important because you're paying for them to grow, and there are other things that happen that helps. But the other thing I found as an option, which in the last iteration of the attempt by the Native Plant Society to have something codified in the legislature, is using native seed, which is, of course, it is random, but it is probably a little more successful in a lot of ways, especially in erosion control and other situations. I'm sorry I missed your early portion of this because I couldn't get on. But what I'd like to talk about, though, is a lot of our seed banks have suffered in the fires, especially down here. Our local flora and fauna are going to be very hard pressed to be replicated for at least 2 or 3 years because of that. Although we know that the coastal sage recovery is part of the fire regime. We don't really encourage, and this is for Stephanie Sherman too. I think using seed in between some clearly, larger plant specimens have been a success, certainly in some of my restoration areas. So I'm not thinking of a planting plan that landscape architects do. Is we have to think outside of that. We have to start to think like, what is the native, I would say, patterning.
Mhm.
And just thought I would make that comment on contract growing because sometimes, I would only get 75% of what I had paid for. And that's, I think, an issue you have to accept.
That's a great point, Stephanie. When I've been on these projects, we still only pay by the plant. So if I ask for 100 plants and I only got 75, I'm still only paying for 75.
Mm,
But and in some cases, there's actually a penalty if they can't produce the number of plants that I need. So it's part of it is how you write your contracts. Now, sometimes your growers if they've not grown that plant before, they're unwilling to take that risk.
right.
And so you need to partner with them to accept, you're going to accept some risk while they're also going to accept some. So I completely agree. It's not cut and dry. I also have seen some great landscape architects that put on their planting plans, rather than individual plants, they'll put a seed mix over a certain area and they specify what that seed mix is. So I completely agree with you. I would say that in regards to fire, we always discourage people from going out while it's still black and dark, and putting in more seed, because oftentimes there is a seed bank or there are root masses that are there that are going to come back. So the first season, I recommend removal of invasive species, but watching the native plants come back before you decide what to add.
Thank you. I totally agree. I'm hoping that everybody hears that. The earnest seed bombers out there.
Yeah, it feels dark, so you want to put seed out there immediately, but oftentimes waiting is the best course of action. Plus, with both, and this is true of container plants and seed, the truth is our genetics may not be perfect and may not be as well adapted to the site as we might want. It might be a native species. It might be a native species that even occurs there, but if it's not from that part, if it's been over cultivated in some cases, sometimes it really won't work as well as the species that are there. So give those time to come back and before you start seed bombing. It's seed bomb in year 2. After we're sure it didn't come back on its own.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Nikki, I think it's your turn.
Yes, thank you, Steve, for being here today. I am a landscape architect student under Stephanie's great leadership. And what got me into this was my obsession, true obsession with native plants and the ecosystems that they support. And it's frustrating because I hear so many people, I like what I like. It's so pretty and the bees love them. And usually meaning like 100% of the time meaning honeybees. Um, and I know that like I say we need 75% because I go with Doug Ptolemy, but I know realistically you're right, 30% is a more
It's a
aspirable.
floor. It's not the ceiling. You can
Yeah,
go
no,
as
I
high as you
know.
want.
At least 30%. And I also, Stephanie, I recommend to basically everyone start with wildflower seeds, emulate nature, succession plant. Even if you're putting in a tree, start small, use wildflowers and smaller shrubs to help build that up. But my question is, how can I more, I guess for lack of better term, respectfully approach people or talk to people about this? And what can I do and my cohort do to increase, to, I guess, advocate for increasing the availability of native plants, especially since we are about to lose Tree of Life Nursery.
Mhm.
Hopefully somebody picks that up. I know there's talks in the works. And we are have lost San Marcos growers, and I know that there's others that are kind of floundering, and I'm sorry if anyone here works for them, but I have no faith in Devil Mountain Nursery from some of the things that I've heard. So, or like personally hurt, not hurt around the water cooler, but personally hurts. So what can I do?
Well, as you're talking to folks, I would certainly start with this is also a question to, I think, Jen's question, answer to Jen's question that was in the chat. When people don't want insects in their landscape for some reason, they think of biting, nasty insects that annoy people. But for most people, you say, what do you want to see? Birds? Do you want to see life in your gardens? I mean, do you want it to be a place of flourishing life? If so, you've got to have insects. Now, most insects aren't biting, aren't annoying, and aren't going to be noticed. And particularly one of the things I love about Doug Calamy is, while it's true that the butterflies or Lepidoptera in general are more closely aligned to individual plants that they've evolved to eat, they're also beautiful, and most people love butterflies. And so they can be your charismatic microfauna that you're advocates for why we want to do this. So talking to people about, do you want birds and butterflies? Do you want hummingbirds? Do you want these things that most people go, oh, those are wonderful? Okay, that's why you want native plants, because you can't get those things without the native plants to really attract and bring them in. And so it builds up. And you can talk about most native bees don't even have stingers. And they're not going to ruin your garden party by flying around you. And that it's most of the insects that are most annoying are the ones that are attracted to your non-native plants. And so while, yes, there's more insects that are attracted to native plants, it's not the annoying ones. It's the ones that you don't even see, that you don't even notice are there. And so I think that's what you don't want, is a sterile landscape that is, I mean, to some extent, if you have to get past people understanding that your landscape can and should do more than just be decoration. And once you get past that, and the opportunity that it can sequester carbon, provide you improved air quality, improved water quality, noise protection, all these values that people, once you start asking them, do you want to not hear your neighbors? Do you want to not hear that road? Do you want to have a beautiful odor in the air that's coming around you as they start to pollinate? Those are all things that we can achieve with the right planting style. And that's how you can start bringing in those native plants. So I think if you ask them, do they want a lot of insects? I don't know a lot of people that would, until they're educated, say, yeah, sign me up. I want lots of bugs. But if you start with, what are the values that they do want? Do you want to see a lot of birds? Do you want to see a lot of wildlife? That's going to be how you bring them in.
Yeah, I've seen, like, somebody I'm close to tried to convince them to do natives. They redid their whole front and backyard. And they're like, oh, but I do get butterflies on this one, like Salvia gregii or some other, not the worst, but we have so many here that are so much better. And I just try to wrong wrong butterflies. You get like 2 or 3 butterflies. I'm talking about like 80 butterflies, 80 different butterflies, all of the butterflies. And then for people who don't know, wasps are in that category of incredibly beneficial. They do not get the light that they deserve. And just like most of our bees, most of our wasps are unable to sting. And how you can introduce this to people is that besides them not being able to sting, and they have some of the most amazing colors, they're also part of an integrative pest management schedule. So their babies exclusively eat insects. So just wanted to add that. Thank you again, Steve.
Oh, my pleasure. And you're selling it to the crowd. I mean, again, if we just start off by saying, do you want to use less pests do you want to use less pesticide in your landscape? Do you want to make sure that your children are healthy and go play and your pets and everything else play in an outdoor environment that's going to be healthy for them? Native plants can help you do that, because they're going to attract those beneficial insects. They're going to make caring for your garden better and produce all life. So that's how you start those conversations, but you find out by asking people what's important to them about their landscape. What do they want to see? And when they don't give you the right answers, then you start asking questions. Well, do you want better air quality? Do you want, these things? Well, yeah. Okay, well, let's do that. So, are there any other questions in the chat that I might have missed?
I see Linda's asking a question.
Okay, I see that. Yeah. It says at the residential scale, it appears impossible to build native plants, landscaping with plants with local native genetics. What is the most practical approach to planning out genetic local natives in smaller scale where contract growing is not available or affordable? Okay, so first off, I will say I'm a restoration ecologist by training, and even I don't always use local genetics. So what I will sort of tell you is that I try to use genetics for as close as possible. And for some species, I won't use them if I can't get local genetics. And what I mean by that is plants that are isolated, have isolated populations that are discontinuous across the landscape, oftentimes will also have pollinators that are discontinuous across the landscape, and they are not trading genetics across the board. But if you take oak trees that are notoriously hybridizing and are constantly trading genetics up and down the coast with the wind and other things, they can probably go a lot further afield than you can other species. So if you just run through a little quick flow chart in your head, is that I'm having that I want to plant when it naturally grows in the environment, is it in small populations that are disconnected from other species or others of its same species? And if so, you probably don't want to use it in your landscape. If, on the other hand, the plant that you want to add is widely dispersed up and down the region, it's probably going to be safer to bring in commercially grown genetics without adversely affecting the local population. Also, in an urban environment, if you're in the WUI, the urban wildland interface, you probably want to be more concerned about using local genetics than if you are in an urban environment. In an urban environment, you can go much further afield in taking that, what local means. Local probably means Southern California when you are in an urban environment versus when you're on the urban, when you're adjacent to the Santa Monica Mountains, you want to get genetics that are local to the Santa Monica Mountains. So hope that answers that question. It's not cut and dry. A lot of the stuff is gray. I wish I could give you a line in the sand that if it's 50 miles away, don't use it. But in some cases, that's not going to matter. In other cases, 50 miles is too far. So it is something you have to get a little bit more educated on. But if you're using common species that are common in the wild, chances are good you're probably not going to have too much problem if you use genetics from a little further away.
I just wanted to make a comment in closing. When I first heard you speak on this topic, it was with the Garden Society, what was it, Garden Club of Santa Barbara. And so we're talking about people with very manicured landscapes, very high-end landscapes, and the enthusiasm around this topic was contagious. Not that I'm not already a native plant enthusiast. And I've also found I live in a condo that has an award-winning garden that was done by a landscape architect that then later on went strictly to natives. But this particular garden is mostly exotics. And when I'm on the board and I'm the single landscape committee person. So when I said I was inviting Carol Bernstein to consult, it was unanimous. Everyone wanted her to come. So I was a little surprised and very encouraged. I think if we're very steadfast and confident in our choices, I think we'll be able to convert other people.
Yeah. And Carol's a great example of a woman who knows her plants, knows her native plants and where they can do best. And so again, there are resources out there. Again, when I was in Texas, I used to consult 2 landscape architects, helping with plant selection. I wasn't doing the design. I'm not a designer. But I know my plants. And so that there are resources out there that as you get into a more difficult or a more challenging landscape where you really want to try to either think about what are the plants that are going to be available when I'm ready to plant and I need to pull from commercial plants as opposed to contract growing or something else. There are ways to find those plants and to pull in some folks that can help coach you through that. and Carol would be a good example.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time out to speak with us. I see Melanie was asking if we could drop the water-wise plant list. I can do
trying to-
that on, do you have it available, or otherwise I can,
I'm gonna go to the website real quick.
oh,
Fine.
wonderful. Thank you. And this is being recorded, so this will be available on our website eventually.
Well, I am actually having a hard time finding it right now. I'm doing the wrong search apparently. So I will send it to you, Alyssa, and then you can add it to the, when it gets
Add it to the recording. Okay, I will. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
Thank you,
And then,
everybody.
hi, everyone. And Jen, yes, we'll find a way to send them the recording. Yes. Okay. Well, everyone have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys.